Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Welcome to This Week in Spokane Valley with Merkel. I am glad to welcome all the returning viewers. Anybody who's new, welcome to the program. I hope you have a chance to watch last week's program. But let's get right into it. We have a lot to cover this week. The first thing I'd like to start with is sort of a legislative report. So let's talk a little bit about what Spokane Valley City Council has done in the last couple of weeks. Normally, I would only be covering the present week's council meeting and a preview of next. But since we skipped last week, let's go ahead and cover all three because 2 weeks ago was a pretty big meeting. So November 12th, the council meeting was a formal council meeting. In a future video, I'll explain the difference between formal council meetings and study sessions. But that was a formal council meeting, and it was a biggie. That was a meeting where many different issues were discussed. Let me tell you about some of those issues. First of all, the proposed budget for 2020 was approved. This is something I'm going to go over in a later program because it'll really relate to some of the other issues that we've talked about, like road maintenance and other things. So it's just important for everybody to know that it was approved. The second thing that was really, really big that made the news was the park ordinance, 1919. So that's the park ordinance that you've probably heard about that banned camping in public parks. Of course, this can't be enforced if there's no space in the shelters. But it did permanently ban camping on City Hall and at Center Place. It also reduced some park hours. It defined what camping was, it defined what loitering was, some of those important issues for our homeless folks. Now, I'm going to really talk about this ordinance a lot more also in a coming video. But suffice to say that, while I think that it's good that we're thinking about this issue, I'm not necessarily sure this is the best way to handle it, although it's at least a step, and it's a step that hopefully will help out in reducing some of the problems in our parks. The other big issue that was discussed was the beginning of the comp plan docket. So the comprehensive plan is basically, so there's an act, it's called the Growth Management Act. Under that act, it requires cities to come up with comprehensive plans that talk about growth and how cities are going to manage growth, how cities are going to manage zoning, and all of the different issues. So really, today's talk about development really has a lot to do with this comprehensive plan. It's amended on a yearly basis. Folks can submit their own comprehensive plan amendments for consideration. Then there's a 5-year large comprehensive plan consideration process that has a whole lot of public hearings and all the rest. The next one's coming up in a couple of years, and I hope we're all involved in that. But for right now, there were a few comprehensive plan amendments proposed. Most of them were city proposed. A lot of times, comprehensive plan amendments that are proposed in these types of in the yearly comprehensive plan movement are corrective actions. In other words, a line on a map got drawn in the wrong place, and the city has to fix it. A zone got artificially declared something different than it really was. The city has to fix it. Issues like that. But in this particular one, there were two, I use the term loosely, citizen-introduced comprehensive amendments. Both were introduced by a developing company. That's Mr. Whipple's company, Whipple Associates. They're on Pines. Both of those were amending the comprehensive plan to allow for the development of multifamily apartments. One on Barker and the other one over in Carnahan. For those folks in Carnahan, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. It looks like you've got some development coming your way, so watch out. Hope you're paying attention. Basically, thankfully, city staff has really responded to a lot of my efforts. You all, again, if you're watching this program, you probably know a little bit about me. You've probably heard of my different efforts to try and curb this unrestricted development, which we're going to talk about today. City staff is finally starting to respond. They're listening to what we want. They're listening to the fact that we don't want them to be changing things willy-nilly at any instance. And surprising me, they actually requested that these two amendments be removed from the comprehensive plan update. And that's great. They didn't support those amendments, and thankfully, City Council agreed with that recommendation. Those two amendments were removed. despite protests from Mr. Whipple, which I'll talk about in a second. Okay, let's move on to... I'm sorry. Before we move on, let's also talk about snow removal on sidewalks. So, I don't know if everybody knows this, but currently the way our law reads is that snow removal on sidewalks is the responsibility of the property owner upon which the sidewalks lie, with the exception of snow removal emergency routes, and for old folks, they can request assistance with that kind of thing. This is... I don't know what words to use. I'm not sure that I agree with this, with the way the law currently reads. I mean, there's so many different exceptions to why, and ticketing folks. I mean, if you think about it, if we're having a snowy day, usually it tends to snow the whole day. So if you get up real early in the morning, go shovel your sidewalk like you're supposed to do, get it taken care of, then you go to work at 6 o'clock. Maybe by noon or 3 o'clock, your sidewalks are covered in snow again. And on top of that, our snowplows right now don't have the vented snowplow blades, which basically allow them not to create berms on top of sidewalks. That's the other problem. The snowplow comes through, and most of the streets where you do have sidewalks, snowplows plow often, comes through, plows the snow off the road right on top of the sidewalk, and you're in it again. So I think right now there's some problems with the way that this law is written. Now the city, to its credit, is trying to solve this. They requested quotes for a company to come and take care of this solution, to contract a company to take care of sidewalk snow removal. And would you believe it? They got 0 quotes. I have a very hard time believing that in a city like Spokane, where we receive snow every year, lots of snow, it's a big problem, lots of companies dedicated to snow removal, that not a single company was willing to bid on this. And I'm going to talk a lot more about our procurement processes again in a later video. It's not the source of this video, but I think that we've got some serious trouble with procurement. They asked the schools to go ahead and provide this service, and the schools refused. Now, I think that, again, I've talked about the fact that we don't have good relationships with other local entities, and the schools is one of them. I think that could have been a great way to pursue. The city didn't give a lot of details in how that negotiation went, what was the substance of that negotiation, but suffice to say, I think that could have been worked a little bit better. Finally, they've decided to rent equipment and do a pilot program on some 22 miles of secondary escape route. I don't have very many details on that, on whose sidewalks are going to get cleared, but for some lucky residents, your sidewalks are going to get taken care of by the city. For everyone else, tough luck, you're on it yourself. Sorry to say. Let's move on to the November 19th study session meeting. So, November 19th, this is a study session meeting, and again, I'm going to talk about what these distinctions are in a later video. The first issue that was discussed was street vacation. So going back to that Carnahan project I was talking about, there were some streets that were vacated, meaning that the city had rights to build streets on property that essentially the city has given up. And that's, again, so that property owner can, use it to build a multifamily. And in this particular case, I want to be specific. It's west of Carnahan, north of 14th. Now, Mr. Whipple made an impassioned speech about the comp plan amendments that he proposed that were removed, that he really, really, really wants to build these apartments. He really wants to build the apartments anywhere he can build the apartments, and it's really difficult for him not to build. It's really difficult for him to buy land in places that are zoned for apartments. So the city just needs to listen to him and zone everything for apartments. I didn't find the testimony very compelling. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the myth of the housing crisis in Spokane Valley, and we'll kind of address some of the points that he was trying to make. Finally, they talked about the Pinecroft Mobile Home Park issue. So you guys have probably heard about this in the news, that Pinecroft Mobile Home Park, recently they're not allowed to drink their water, or at least there was an informational request not to drink the water because of E. coli poisoning. Now basically the city council rightly requested some information on what the city could do to prevent this kind of thing in the future, or could look at it. And staff basically said that the city can't do anything. I hate it when staff does that. We're going to talk about that in a future video, but I think that there are many things that could be done, but essentially that's what came out of that presentation. Finally, the lobbyist contract was looked at. We only received one applicant for the lobbyist contract. Again, procurement issues. It's a big issue, and they wanted $90,000 per year. So the city staff argued that we should approve this contract because it's in our benefit to have a lobbyist on before the session starts, even though our estimate was $60,000 and it came back in $90,000. Because if we don't approve an estimate or a lobbying contract before the session starts, we might be late to the lobby fest. Well, as I've mentioned in the last video, I think, and just to let you know a little bit, I'm always a little bit. I don't like cities using tax money to lobby for different issues. There are instances where it makes sense when you're talking about grants, when you're talking about road funding and things that are multi-sectoral, so they extend beyond the city. So in other words, you have a street that goes between several municipalities, like Pines, for instance. It goes from the county to the city, out of the city into the county again. You have railroad crossings that are kind of intersectoral. So basically, you have something that's in between different municipalities where no individual municipality could really take care of the total cost. It makes sense to me to lobby the state government where they can kind of come in and help all the municipalities to work together to take care of something. Sure. So let's move on to the next session. So the next session is November 26th. That's coming up next week. That's going to be another formal session of the council. There's going to be a few things in there. There's one that's really, really important. So the council is going to discuss a no income tax resolution. Now, just to be clear, resolutions are not things that I like. They're basically a statement that says that we like something or don't like something, but they actually cost us a lot of taxpayer money to issue. A lot of research has to go into resolutions, staff time, proclamations have to be basically put out. So in this particular case, this resolution doesn't actually prohibit us from passing a tax. It's a statement against income taxes. And like I said, I hate wasting time on political issues that really don't have any teeth. If we don't want to have an income tax, we should pass a law that says we're not going to have one. Otherwise, why waste the time? The second big thing that they're going to discuss on the 26th is procurement regulations. Now, I would like to call on folks to attend this meeting with me on the 26th. This is an important issue. It may not seem like it's an important issue, but I've already pointed out a couple of examples where procurement regulations can really be important. I think our city fails on procurement. And what's really sad is that we are what's called a contract city. That means that our whole city government is designed against contracting for services rather than having government entities do those services. So it's really sad when your procurement rules, which is how you contract, aren't sufficient to really make sure that that contracting goes well. So what the procurement regulations propose to do, they propose to match the state in removing the requirement for competition on certain city contracts. So they're going to expand the minimum amount for city contracts for competition from $15,000 for a city contract to $25,000 for a city contract. They're also going to change the minimum threshold for competition from $40,000 to $65,000 if one trade is involved, i.e., so an example, if you have a plumbing contract, something to fix the plumbing, excuse me, if that contract is $40,000 right now or more, we have to seek competition, which I think is a very high threshold. We're going to raise that to $65,000. So anything below $65,000, the city can call up Uncle Bob's Plumbing, the mayor's uncle, and they're going to have him do the work. I don't think that's really how we should run. Finally, if there's more than one trade involved, the raise is going to be from $75,000 to $116,000. That's a big raise. So if you think about that, that might be like constructing City Hall, where you had plumbers, you had bricklayers, all the different trades. You could build, for $116,000, just think about what kinds of things the city government could do without competing them. That's just, to me, it's beyond the pale. I can't believe that these are the limits that we're looking at. So I was a federal government contracting officer for a great long time, and from the federal government's perspective, that limit was $5,000. Five. So if the federal government can operate on a limit of 5, how is it that we need such a high limit? Why is it that we need to give away all these contracts on a sole source basis? Competition is the foundation of classical capitalist economy. Without competition, we spend more and we get less. I just don't understand why we're doing this. So I'll be there on the 26th to speak out against this, and I hope some of you join me. Thanks. So let's talk about today's main issue. Today I want to talk about uncontrolled development. So you're probably asking yourself, what is uncontrolled development? Well, uncontrolled development is currently what our city's biggest problem is. Another way you could say it is unmanaged development, or basically development willy-nilly. That's another way that somebody has put it before. So you ask yourself, wait. So when a city develops, when a city grows, where do the people go? Where do the businesses go? How does that work? Well, let's answer that. If you don't think about these things, what happens? Well, is there access to the services? Is there access to the infrastructure these things need? Well, all the things are needed for support. Let's think about that. Law enforcement. So if you build a community with walls all around it, how can law enforcement get in to surveil that community? You have to consider these things. What happens? Ambulance support, right? So if you build a community that takes 40 minutes to get to through populated streets without proper thoroughfares, how do the ambulances get there in an emergency? If you have, for instance, one of the big problems in our city, you have railroads that cut across, and those railroads don't have grade separation, which is going to be a big issue next year. Grade separation is where a railroad either passes under or over a street so that neither interferes with traffic from the other. Well, in our city, there's a lot of places where we still have railroads that cross right over top of streets. And let me tell you, they have that issue has killed people before. There have been people waiting in an emergency for an ambulance that was stuck behind a train that couldn't get to the other side, and people have died in our city from that issue. Public transportation is another one. If you build a low-income apartment complex away from public transportation, you start to imagine, low-income apartment complex, a lot of these people are going to rely on public transportation for their everyday life. So if they don't have access to buses, if it takes 3 miles to walk to a bus stop, that low-income apartment complex is really going to be underserved. Those people are going to have a hard time getting to work. They can't get to work. They can't get paid. They need more services. You guys know the deal. Schools is another one. If you're not thinking about how education is going to serve the complexes or additional neighborhoods that you're building, you're going to run into some big trouble. We all know how overpopulated the schools in the valley are already. And what really, really irks me is that right now you might buy a home in a place like Middle. So you're setting down roots, you're buying a home, and the truth is your kid might not be able to get into Ponderosa or Horizon or U-High. Your kid might have to be bused across the city, make friends with people in a school across the city, and the very next year get moved into Ponderosa or Horizon. That's just bizarre, right? We have to find a way to fix that system. There's other services to think about. Like grocery stores and other things. Food. If you sprawl out too far and too far away from the services that people need, it really starts to become an encumbrance to your city. Not to mention snow transportation. We've got to think about, okay, what if there's an emergency? What if in our area it would probably be snow, something like ice storm, but it could also be firestorm. You think about emergency evacuations. What if there's an emergency evacuation need? How are people going to get out and in? And when you overpopulate an area, and I'm going to talk about a specific example of this in a few minutes, when you overpopulate an area, you really cause a hazardous situation. So what are some of the symptoms of poor planning? I'm going to tell you some of these symptoms, and I want you to think while I'm talking about these, do we have these symptoms? Is this something we're seeing? So the number one is an increase in traffic wait times. So just to answer your question, our traffic wait times in our area have end over end doubled every year for the last 4 years. You all have noticed this. I know that you're driving down Pines and realizing, oh my God, there are times when you have to go through 3 or 4 light cycles before you get through. Pines, Barker, Sullivan, these streets are almost impassable. I avoid them like the plague. I'm sure you do too. So do we have traffic? I think we do. Is our traffic getting much worse? I think it is. So that's symptom number one. The next is school overcrowding. I already talked about that. Let's move forward. The next is an unstable property market. Has anybody else noticed how unstable our property market is? How unstable it has become? Now, instability doesn't necessarily have to mean that house prices are falling. It can also mean that house prices are ballooning. And that's exactly what's happening in our property market. I think it's a little too much and a little too fast. And it scares me because of what happens as a result. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Speculation on land use. Are there people thinking about buying typical properties that typically aren't investments as investments? Are there people that are thinking about buying a couple extra houses or things of that nature on an investment basis? I think we all know that right now there are, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Neighborhood fear. I don't know about you, but I live in the Ponderosa. I talk to residents every day. We're worried about what's going on. We're worried about the situation. We're worried about the people that are in power, whether they have our needs and our wants and our goals and our well-being in their interest. We're not sure. We have to constantly be vigilant. We have to constantly be looking out. Who's going to develop where and what are they doing? We have to pay attention to all these public notices. It's become very, very strenuous. And it's difficult for people whose everyday lives are already strenuous with work issues and family issues. And now on top of that, you have to worry about your property values. You have to worry about who's building in your neighborhood. What might happen if they build? Should I move now? Should I move later? That's intense, and it's happening right now. As we move through the cycle, so those are early symptoms, right? There are later symptoms. Let's talk about later symptoms. When the problem has gotten a lot worse, you have neighborhood breakdown. So you have neighborhoods that all of a sudden start, neighborhoods that once used to be nice neighborhoods, good areas to live in, start breaking down, start becoming crime-ridden. House properties, property values fall. You get problem houses, more and more problem houses. You get crime dens moving in. That's a problem. Crime is another big one. So we're already seeing a small increase in crime, but as overpopulation, as poor planning continues, you start getting more and more and more crime. The police can't keep up. Services can't keep up. Crime comes in to take advantage of the situation. Average income fall. That's another good thing to see. So if you look at the downturn in Detroit or several other American cities, the first thing you notice when poor planning happens, average income starts to decline. Why is that? Well, home values start to go down. People start to move in that have lower income. So overall, the whole city income starts to fall. When the whole city income starts to fall, people can't afford better services or higher end goods. Those things disappear. Those jobs leave with them. It's a big problem. That kind of leads to job loss. That's what I just said. Finally, you have bust-based stagnation. So in other words, you might have this ridiculous climb and values, property values, and all this other stuff, and all of a sudden, poof, it busts, and then everything falls down, and then you have stagnation. And that stagnation is unbelievably difficult to fix. And that leads to property value plummet. So those are some of the symptoms of poor planning. And I don't know about you, but I hope you agree with me that we're seeing a lot of those symptoms today in our own city, in our own valley. And that worries me. That worries me. I think we're still early in the cycle of bad planning. I think there's still time for us to do something about it, but we have to act now. So you're probably saying, well, can you give me some examples of some poor planning? Sure. Let's think about Ponderosa. So Ponderosa is a lovely area. That's where I live. I love this area, right? And for years and years and years, one of the most well-off areas in the city, one of the most protected areas in the city. Is beautiful. Well, here's the thing. There are only two ways into Ponderosa. one way in, one way out. That's it. So when you have a concentration of people living with only two ways in and out, it starts to become dangerous. Many of you, if you live in Ponderosa and you're watching this, you remember Firestorm. You remember these issues. You remember the 2-hour waits to get out. Well, they're still building in Ponderosa. They're still expanding development in Ponderosa. That is poor planning. In my mind, we shouldn't be developing Ponderosa or increasing the sprawl out south until we find a solution for another entrance. Let's talk about apartment complexes everywhere. You guys have seen the apartment complexes come up. There's apartment complexes in all kinds of locations that aren't zoned for apartment complexes. How is that happening? I'll talk about how easy it is to change zoning a little bit later. But suffice to say, you know that these multifamily places are coming in, they're low-income places, and they're affecting your property values, they're affecting your crime rates, they're dens of crime sometimes. And it's not that apartment complexes should never be built. It's that if you plan them correctly, you don't build them in the middle of a neighborhood where they don't have access to services. I mean, they're high-density units. They need high-flow streets, they need access to public utilities, they need access to supermarkets. You have to be conscious of the types of folks who afford and who purchase these units or rent these units. What are the specialized services that they need? And placing them in the middle of a neighborhood that is disjointed from all those services will yield to all kinds of problems. Another good point is decentralized commerce. So think about island commerces. Okay, that's a term that's used a lot when you talk about. So, for instance, a lot of you know about my involvement in the detox facility that was coming into the Ponderosa. That's island commerce. Basically, an area that doesn't have anything like it, all of a sudden there's one there. That hurts. That hurts overall development. We all know that it allows other types of those things to encroach into neighborhoods, into all kinds of different, into park areas, and use land in ways that wasn't originally intended. So we need to be careful about that. Let's think about Barker Road. The entirety of Barker Road, basically. Anybody who lives out there knows that 10 years ago, Barker Road was an empty road. You could drive up and down any time of the day and no problem at all. It hasn't been increased one little bit, and yet we've got probably 20 to 30 times the resident. If you look at our city, where has it grown the most? The most of it is on Barker Road. When I talked about end-over-end growth, we went from 60,000 to 100,000. Just about all those 40,000 people are in some way served by Barker. And yet, the road hasn't changed. You think about that. That's a recipe for disaster. You know, part of that is Morningside. You know, I love Morningside. The homes there, the community there. It's a beautiful place to live. But unfortunately, when you look at Morningside, look at it on a map. Look at it at Google Maps. There's about 4 to 5 miles, 4 to 5 square miles of neighborhood that doesn't have a single arterial servicing it. If you live in Morningside, you know what I'm talking about. People coming home from work are driving down residential streets that are supposed to be 25 miles per hour. They're going 50, 55, coming home from work, and that's just the way it has to be. I don't think it should be that way. I think that there needs to be solutions for that, but that is the definition of unplanned development. It's just sprawl to sprawl to sprawl, and it has no access to the arterials, to the roads it needs for folks to be able to go to work. And I hope to God it doesn't lead to a casualty, but it's a dangerous situation. So, who is responsible for this? Well, you know, a lot of people would say, well, it's the contractors, it's the builders, it's the people who are putting this stuff in that's responsible. You know, there are some bad actors, certainly. I've spoken about some. I know you all know the bad actors that I'm talking about. There are bad actors in our city. But the truth is that it's really not their fault. You know, we live in a capitalist society. Somebody taking advantage and building something at the bottom dollar, that is their right. That's how capitalism works. You shouldn't blame anybody for doing what's legal and doing what they can get away with. I mean, at the end of the day, that's how our country became great. But that being said, it's not their fault, right? Companies should look out for their interests. People should look out for their interests. As I said in the last video, the entity that looks out for everybody's interest is supposed to be government. They're supposed to cross over the top of the two groups to say, okay, how can we bridge the gap? And that's the issue, is that it's really the city government, the city code, that is to blame for this overheated development. Loose planning and building codes to contractors are what is causing this, right? You get what you regulate, basically. I mean, and there are developers who will tell you the same thing. There are developers who do great work, great jobs in other cities like Liberty Lake or even in Spokane, who won't come and work in the valley because they get underbid and undercut by cut-rate developers who are doing everything legally, but nonetheless dangerously for our city. And that's part of the problem. You have to, your codes have to speak to the bottom dollar. They have to speak to the bottom requirement. And right now, I think our codes are below that bottom requirement. Now, there's kind of this constant philosophical argument between, about who's really responsible. Is it the consumer? Because a lot of people would say, well, it's not the developer that's responsible. It's the people who buy these properties that's responsible. They shouldn't be purchasing properties if they don't think that they're built correctly, if they want more. Well, to be fair, I wish I could give the consumers that much credit. But unfortunately, any of you who have bought a home, which should be a lot of you if you're watching this video from the Valley, any of you who bought a home could probably tell me it's not a simple transaction. It's a complicated transaction. So complicated that you hire all these specialists to tell you, whether title insurance and whether your boundaries are correct, and you have a home inspector to tell you this. And at the end of the day, right, there's so much complication. I don't think that you can really leave it up to consumers who are non-specialists to make sure that this stuff gets taken care of. I don't think it's fair when you're talking about residencies. And, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because it's a big debate. Is it the customer who's responsible? Some people say, well, it's the contractors who should be responsible. They should be doing a good job. Again, I think that they should build things to their interest. I applaud and I praise and I ask for the contractors who do above and beyond, who do what's more than the minimum, but what's required to really live. I think that they're great. But let's be honest, not every contractor is going to do that. Not every contractor is so scrupulous. We have to find, so it comes right back down to who's really responsible. In my mind, it's the city. The city government needs to think about, okay, what can consumers realistically handle in terms of responsibility? And I can tell you that most cities in the U.S. have already figured this out. Spokane Valley, we're kind of low on the curve. So a lot of you have heard the trendy new thing is to talk about the housing crisis. Oh my God, we have a housing crisis. People need houses. We need affordable houses. Nobody can afford houses anymore. And I think that as a nation, I think that's a serious problem. I think that as a state, I think that's a serious problem. I think if you look at a county, that's a serious problem. If you are in the city of Spokane, that's a serious problem. What about if you're in Spokane Valley? I'm here to tell you today that Spokane Valley, does not have this problem. What? You might be asking, well, how can all these other things, some of them that go around Spokane Valley, have this problem, but Spokane Valley doesn't? Well, let me tell you, in order for you to have a crisis like this, what you're talking about, or a shortage, you're talking about an excess in demand versus a detriment in supply, right? So you don't have enough supply to meet demand. Well, when you're talking about a city like Spokane Valley, who is demanding, okay? Our city is 80% single-family home owned. That means that 8 out of 10 of the people that are watching this video, if not more, own their own home or live in a home that is owned by somebody. And the other 2 may be renting, all right? So the people who live in a home are probably not demanding another home. The people who are renting, I get it, you're probably looking. But, as in all things, we have to think about the majority of citizens. So the majority of us have a home. We're already in it, Okay? This is very different than a lot of other places. Like, for instance, the city of Spokane is a great example. In the city of Spokane, about 55% of the residents are renters. That means that those renters are subject to rent increases. They're subject to all kinds of rental management problems. You know, for instance, you might have somebody who moves in next to you that turns out to be a really bad neighbor. They're subject to parking regulations, to all kinds of issues. Well, the truth is that as a renter, you need to be able to have access to multiple openings for rent in order to keep your rent affordable. Otherwise, it could balloon in times of excess external demand, like what we're seeing here today. You can be sitting in your apartment and all of a sudden your landlord is saying, oh, we're going to raise your rent 10%, 20%, 30%. And if you're in a home, the situation's a lot different. The bank doesn't raise your mortgage. I mean, we're long past the days of adjustable rate mortgages. Those have pretty much all died since the housing crisis. Most people are on fixed rate mortgages. And the truth is their mortgages don't raise. That means that no matter what the demand is, they're paying the same amount. And that's great. They have stability, they have stable lives, they can handle it. But renters don't have that stability. So there has to be vacancies in town to allow renters to move from place to place. That competition is what keeps rent affordable. And if you don't have that competition, if your vacancy rate is less than 3%, you're going to have a really, really, really hard time for your renters. The prices are going to go through the roof. Affordability is going to be an issue. Loss of income is going to be an issue. And that's what you're seeing in the city of Spokane. You could argue that's what you're seeing in the county as a whole because it includes the city of Spokane. But when you look at the valley, that's just not the case. Our demand is external. That means that it is people who live outside the valley who want to move here that are demanding more houses, more rentals, more units. Well, I gotta tell you that as somebody who wanted to run for city council, or what our government should consider, they just don't need to consider the wants and the needs of people that are external to the valley. It's just not really, like there's no reason that the people who are internal to the valley, the people who are actually our government's constituents, should have to suffer because somebody from San Francisco wants to move here, or somebody from Idaho wants to move here. In my mind, if you want to move here, that's great, but it's on you. The cost is on you, right? It shouldn't be on my neighbor Brian, who's 75 years old, who's lived here for 45 years. It shouldn't be Brian who has to pay for this guy from San Francisco through additional traffic and all this other stuff. So in my mind, that's the way regulations should work. So does Spokane Valley have a housing crisis? No, we don't have a housing crisis today. But the more we build, the closer we are to creating one, especially as we build rentals. The higher the proportion of our population that is living in rentals, whether they're duplexes or whether they're apartments, the more worrisome it becomes for becoming a housing crisis. And when that happens, we are going to have to consider building more units, just like what Spokane is doing. But today, we have the luxury of not doing that. I just hope that our city government can jump on it and recognize that we shouldn't do that because we don't want to create that bubble for ourselves. And I'll talk about more of that in a second. So who's moving here? Like we just talked about, we've got all kinds of external residents. It's not people internally. It's not homeowners who are all of a sudden deciding to get rid of their home and get an apartment. That's not what's happening, right? It's people who love our area, who love Spokane Valley, or maybe Spokane in general, who want to live in a nice neighborhood. And that's great. I applaud them for wanting that. But it costs you life savings to get here. It costs me life savings to get here, etc. I don't think that we should have to pay for them too. So that's kind of my point. There's a lot of people who say, okay, well, this must all be about taxes, right? Is the city government trying to get more taxes? Is that why they're doing this? Is that why they have so much open development? Well, I'm here to tell you that's not the case. In fact, from a tax perspective, residential development is a big pain. It hurts our tax flow basis. You're probably saying, what? How could that be? More people, you got to be more taxes. Not in Washington State. It's really important to remember that we live in Washington State. And the biggest thing that Washington State does not have is an income tax. That means we don't make any money directly off of anybody who moves here. right? You can move here. You don't have to pay any taxes to us. I mean, if you're homeless, you don't have to pay any property tax, right? If you don't buy anything, you don't have to pay any sales tax. Well, that's kind of the kicker. So I'm here to tell you that a little more than a half of our budget is generated by sales tax. Okay? Sales tax. That is the biggest revenue generator for our city budget. About a quarter of our city budget is generated from all kinds of other fees, okay, and grants from the state government and things like that. And about a quarter of our budget comes from property tax. So you're probably thinking, oh, okay, well, property tax. Yeah, obviously people pay property tax. Well, here's the thing about that. When I looked at the budget, again, the one that was recently approved in 2020 and then 2019 budget, I find that there's a huge negative imbalance when it comes to this. The amount of money that we spend on residential upkeep, that is fixing roads for residences, fixing pipes, utilities, through fares for residential areas, all the rest, the amount of our budget that's spent on that is 1/3. So we're spending 1/3 of our budget to fix residential areas and to upgrade residential areas, add sidewalks and add bike paths and all this other stuff. Yet we're only collecting about 1/4 of our budget on property taxes. Well, as you can see, that means that we're spending more on residential areas than what we're collecting. And that rate is going to be pretty well fixed. It doesn't matter if you have more people or less people, essentially it's going to be fixed. In fact, it gets worse the higher you go in terms of density. You're probably thinking, wait, how does that work? Well, let's think about it. If you build an apartment complex, that apartment complex might be worth $3 million. That seems like a lot. But if it can hold something like 10,000, or well, let's say 1,000 people in that apartment complex for $3 million, you divide that out, and the amount of property tax per person is very little. On the other hand, on that same area, you might be able to build $3 million worth of homes, okay? So maybe the same coverage, but it's probably only going to be something like 100 people, because we all know a house has to have a lawn, it's got to have rooms, all the rest. You know, the space utilization is much greater on homes than it is on multifamily. So that means that the amount of property tax per person, and remember, per person means per user, users of roads, of schools, of all the rest, is much higher on homes than it is on multifamily. So as we try and build up and condense, we're actually losing tax money on that. So, so then it's not about taxes. So you're probably saying, well, then what's it about? I've been asking myself that for 3 years. One of the big problems I mentioned the other day was this political machine that we have in our city, the Shea machine. And I can tell you that the only answer I've been able to really come up with is it's philosophical. The Shea machine wants to pad the Spokane Valley with more and more voters. Why? So that we can overtake Spokane as sort of the more conservative arm of our area and to become even more hyperly conservative. You've heard them call us the state of liberty. They're looking to break the state in half. They need more voters to do it. That's what they're looking to do. I can't say that I understand it. I can't even say if that's really what the reason is, but that's the best I've been able to come up with. And that's pretty sad, because honestly, I don't care about this kind of weird political philosophy if it's not making returns for the people who we represent, for the people who pay their taxes in the valley, for the people who expect the service in the valley, for the people who take care of their neighbors, etc. If it's not making returns for them, why on earth are we doing something like this? So I advocate that we don't do things like that. So how do we solve this? How do we take care of this issue? What are the tools we have? Well, the number one tool that we have that everybody always thinks about is traditional zoning. That is to say, oh, this is a residential zone, this is a commercial zone, breaking up those things into multifamily residential versus residential. And that's kind of the traditional way that cities have kind of controlled development. They've put it into different pockets. Here's what I have to tell you about traditional zoning. The first big problem with traditional zoning is that Washington State is trying to get rid of it. Washington State wants to get rid of the single-family zone especially. And again, that's because the state as a whole has a housing crisis. Seattle has a housing crisis. The city of Spokane has a housing crisis. Spokane Valley does not, but we live in the state. The state's making decisions because the state wants areas like Spokane Valley that don't have a housing crisis, that have much lower utilization of land, to build upwards to cram more people in. I just have to tell you that I don't really care about the state's problems. It's kind of annoying that they're taking away something that cities use to control for these issues and to make decisions about their own future. But that's the way it's going. There's a big movement in the Washington state government to get rid of zoning. So expect to see residential zones eliminated in the near-term future. But, it's not all bad news. I mean, the truth is that traditional zoning, as I said before, isn't actually all that great. One of the big problems with traditional zoning is it's very top-down in nature. That means that you have a bunch of guys sitting in a room sort of saying, well, you can build a house here, and over here you're going to build a store, and over here you're going to build this. And the truth is, what if they get it wrong? What if they don't zone enough for houses? What if they don't zone enough for stores? These are the things that create instabilities in the market. And those instabilities are what lead to bubbles. They can form their own problems, right? So zoning isn't necessarily the best thing. The other issue is under the Growth Management Act, changing zones is actually relatively easy. I told you I talked about this a little bit earlier. When you change a zone, you go in, you apply to change the zone. The city distributes a letter to people that are within 400 feet of that zone change, and nobody else. Those are the people that really have to do, and when the city hearing examiner or the city council examines whether that zone should be changed, legally they're only supposed to look at the people at the area that is affected by that zone change, which is a very small area. I'll talk about something that kind of breaks through this in a few minutes. But that means that conversation can happen over and over and over. And as we have all seen, that leads to zone incursion. That's where one guy gets approval to change a part of the zone, and then the next guy comes in and justifies his approval based on the last guy. That's how zones change over time. And like I said, because it's such a small conversation, you don't take into account how many other people it might affect or how it might change the whole zone or any of those other things. That's not allowed to be taken into account. It's really problematic. So, it's just that's a problem. The other problem, and this one, I mean, take it with a grain of salt, but you can create discrimination with this kind of stuff. Now, I'm not a big guy who wants to yell at the top of the mountains about discrimination, but if you think about it, zoning leads to zoning. That means that if you live in a place that has poor stuff, poor people, etc., the city tends to zone for stuff around that. So they say, well, that place is kind of poor and crappy, let's put the jail there. And that can sometimes be not fair, right? It kind of keeps the rich areas rich and the poor areas poor, right? It doesn't allow anybody to sort of say, hey, I see an opening for doing something different in this area and cleaning something up. That, like I said, that's kind of the thing that happens top-down approaches. I think it should be a little more open than that, and I'll talk about that in a second. So another tool that people talk about is what you call form-fitting regulations. Now this is where you still have zones, but they're looser than traditional zoning. And they basically state that you can build things within the zone, more things than you would normally be able to build, as long as they sort of conform to what else is in that zone. And I mean, that's better, that's helpful, but at the same time, that conform to what else is in the zone can really be misused. And it becomes sort of, it's a hard way, when you're arguing those cases in front of counsel or in front of the hearing examiner, what does it mean to conform? It's basically a blade that can cut both ways. And I think that it's not really the best way to go about this. So let me talk, so what is the best way? I think the best way is economic impact assessment. I think the best way is to use economics to figure out how to control for this. How do we do that? Well, I think that anytime so if you got rid of zones, you're probably thinking, oh no, get rid of zones. Well, our city is already built. There's already areas that have different requirements, etc. I think that those requirements basically lead to economic impact. So if you have a neighborhood with single-family homes that has, an undivided street, no sidewalks, no traffic light access, okay? So what if you want to put a multifamily development in that neighborhood? What if you want to put a 6,000 unit high-density apartment complex in that neighborhood? Well, under traditional zoning, you're only responsible for your frontage. So they might apply to get some part of that neighborhood changed to the zone that they're looking for. They might succeed in that. They might have to build a sidewalk right in front of their apartment complex, but the rest of the neighborhood, tough luck. Somebody else is going to have to figure that out. And I think that is a bizarre way to look at situations. If you think about the economic impacts, on the other hand, if you say, okay, you can build your apartment complex, but in order to do it, you're going to have to upgrade all the streets in this neighborhood to divided streets. That means that you're going to have to pay for all that as the contractor who wants to do this thing. You're going to have to pay to put in sidewalks throughout this entire neighborhood. You're going to have to pay to upgrade the sewer capacity, to upgrade the water capacity, electricity capacity, to take care of all this. You're going to have to put traffic control devices in to take care of your traffic on a daily basis. You're going to have to subdivide your lot and put in a supermarket to take care of people. You're going to have to put in a bus stop. I mean, you start adding all these economic impacts together and you realize like, oh, well, this is going to be very expensive. And I think that if done properly, the developer would just say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to focus on an area that already either has those things or where it's appropriate to locate what we're doing. That's going to kind of really stop up development. It's going to slow things way down, but at the same time, it's going to keep things kind of commensurate with the rate of inflation. You're not going to see a whole lot of new homes and things built because the impact is going to be exponentially higher for each new thing, right? You have a big open piece of land, the impact of building something is very little. But once you have a neighborhood, once you have something that's established, the impact is much greater. And that means that as we go forward, development gets more expensive and it gets slower. But on the flip side, anytime the development does happen, the biggest concerns about development, traffic and schools and streets and all these other things, infrastructure, they get taken care of by that developer. So the way you do that is by having an impact assessment by the city. They go through, they look at the way, they look at all the different economic impacts and they say, okay, you want to build this thing? Fine. Here's your list of economic impacts. This is what it's going to cost you in addition to your construction price. And then c'est la vie. I think that's the best way to go forward. We don't have to rely on zoning. It's not top down. If somebody sees an opportunity to do something with land that nobody else saw, fair enough. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to pay for those economic impacts. That's kind of the beauty of a capitalist system, and I think that that's the way we can go. So you're probably saying, okay, well, what happens if it's too late? And that's a great question. Because if we don't jump on this, it will be too late. You guys have all been to Seattle, or a lot of you have been. You'll notice that Seattle is a place that happened with unplanned development. And as a result, a lot of neighborhoods are way overdeveloped. So you have a tiny little skinny road that cuts through a neighborhood that has these huge high-rise apartment complexes. And you say, how can this be served by this tiny little road? And you're trying to drive down it, and cars have to pull off to the side to get past each other. I mean, it's a big, big problem. Well, that is the result of unplanned development at its latest stages. So the city has to start doing things to kind of retroactively fix this. You guys have all heard that in most Seattle neighborhoods, you actually have to pay money, you have to pay for a license to park your own car in your own neighborhood on your own street. Man, that's... I want to avoid that. I don't want to get to that place. The other thing that you start to do is congestion charges. Again, that's trying to put a Band-Aid over unplanned development. You're like, oh no, there's too much congestion. We didn't plan for it. Let's just start making people pay for it. Again, man, that really sucks when you're trying to get to work. And one year you're going to work and the next year you have to pay, $20 a day to go to work. Congestion charges are very difficult to deal with. You get this property roller coaster where, all of a sudden some properties are worth just tons and tons of money and then other properties are worth nothing. And then it just bounces and bounces and bounces. And that's what we're seeing in Seattle all over the place. How do I know that we're approaching this problem? Well, let me show you guys an article that was recently published in the Spokesman. This is an article that talks about Spokane named the top market for out of area home buyers. Do you know what that means? That means we're starting to get back into the bubble economy. That means people are coming to our market. They're not buying a house to live in. They're buying a house to invest in. That's where you get the bubble. Investors who don't live in houses, if you don't live in a house and you buy it to speculate, then just as quickly you start to sell it if the market goes bad. Well, that's a big problem. Up until now, we've been kind of operating on actual, real demand. That means that people who are buying houses, I know our housing market is crazy, but they're actually moving into them. But if we move into speculation demand, if there's a bunch of empty houses that are coming up, that is the beginning of a bubble. That's the bubble that's going to pop. And I'm afraid it's already happening.